Hi everyone, welcome to part 2 of this lecture on simulation and serious game, where we're going to be tackling the concept of serious games. So a serious game is a game that is not just designed for the player to have fun, but it's a game designed for you to learn things about the world, maybe in education, a political idea, or make you care more deeply about something, the way that a game can. So the idea of serious games was originally emerged in 1970 from a scholar called Clark Abt, who was an early pioneer of computer simulations in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so this is in the use of games to computer simulations to depict things like air battles and space missions and the role that new technologies might play in military scenarios. How might a much faster weapon deployment system change the balance of equilibrium between these two forces, for instance? So Clark writes that we are concerned with serious games in the sense that these games have an explicit and carefully thought out educational purpose and are not intended to be played primarily for amusement. This does not mean that serious games are not or should not be entertaining. Abt, in writing about serious games, was motivated by what he saw as the separation of thought and action as a disease of civilization. He has these great phrases like physically disactive thought and mentally inactive action. His point with serious games is that games with social decision making allow learners not to just think, but to participate. And games allow for thought and action to be integrated. And in doing so, there are new opportunities for learning and education. And particularly in a way that kind of is more applicable to daily life afterwards. Ian Bogost writes in 2007 that games communicate differently than other media. They not only deliver messages, but they also simulate experiences. Games influence players to take action through gameplay. While often thought to be just a leisure activity, Bogost argues that games can also become rhetorical tools. And Bogost is really interested particularly in the genre of news games and how games can be part of news media. Like Abt, Bogost argues that unlike the oversimplification of sound bites that seem to have overtaken public discourse, games can deal with complexity. The world is made up of complex interconnected systems, and games can model these. Issues like global warming, refugee crises, and ISIS, how we might not typically not think of these as linked, games can model the complexity of this as an interconnected system to understand how these things dynamically interact in a way that is difficult in kind of simple words or narrative or pictures, right? So rhetoric has a couple of different meanings. We might just simply use rhetoric as the study of writing and speaking as a means of communication or persuasion. But we also see definitions in this effective use of speech. You've got good rhetoric. But in modern usage, we're a little bit more suspicious about it. The undue use of exaggeration or display or bombast, right? Something like the mayor's promise to fight drugs was empty rhetoric because there was no money to back that up. We also see rhetoric used to refer to things like visual rhetoric, that you can, by putting images together, you can communicate something with them. So the point here is that this is the word rhetoric here in procedural rhetoric is referring to how the procedures can communicate something. But those communications aren't objective, right? But they are subjective to the person who is creating that communication, and sometimes they don't have to be in good faith. As Bogost states it, though, he describes rhetoric as effective expression. The field of media studies already studies visual rhetoric, the art of using imagery and visual representations in a persuasive way. But procedural rhetoric is the art of persuasion through rule-based representations. What Bogost is referring to there is simulations, and interactions rather than the spoken word, writing, images, or moving pictures. How is it that a game, not just in its visual appearance, but in its simulation, expressing something and trying to persuade you about a worldview or what the world is like? And so this idea of procedurality comes from Janet Murray's book Hamlet on the Holodeck, where she's referring to the ability to execute a series of rules. The interactive procedurality of video games and computer games fundamentally separates them from other media because of this ability to act on a series of rules and then kind of quite dynamically generate a new set of rules against which you can interact. This back and forth between us and the game. So Bogost's procedural rhetoric then, understanding what rhetoric is and what procedurality is. A procedural rhetoric makes a claim about how something works by modeling its processes in the process native environment of the computer game rather than using description or depiction. What we're going to be exploring through our required gamings in class and in your play at home and through the key reading is this practice of using processes persuasively. Because that's what I want you to do in your assignment 3, is I want you to come up with an idea for a game that uses the processes of play to make a claim about how something works in a persuasive way. Because the way that a game models the process, that dynamic system, that simulation, makes a claim about how that world works. To stay on that for a moment, I'll refer you back to some of the examples from the previous lecture part where we were looking at games like Sims and SimCity. Because SimCity makes a claim about how cities work by modeling the processes of the city and traffic and happiness and things like that. But because of the way that it leaves things out, it's making a claim, although pretty inane from the perspective of a leisure game, but a big issue if you were trying to say that SimCity was a serious game. It's not making a claim about issues like racism and poverty and inequality. Another kind of key point I want to make here around games is that games are good for different kinds of ways of knowing. You look at it, maybe an example like learning math, right? Games aren't maybe the best opportunity for knowing how to do algebra because of the nature of that type of knowledge. But what games are good for is tacit knowledge. Knowledge that's difficult to transfer to another person just by means of writing it down or verbalizing it. Games allow us to have repetition and failure, learning through trial and error. And they also allow us to kind of get a feel for something in a way that just reading it doesn't, thinking back to that example of asteroids earlier in the lecture. A good example of this is a game called Kerbal Space Program. I'm going to mention a lot of games in this lecture, and my kind of expectation is that I don't expect you to have played Kerbal Space Program, but if you're interested and motivated to follow along, pause me right now and go look at another video on YouTube of Kerbal Space Program, so you just get a bit of a sense of what's involved in the play of that game. Like how if we were doing film studies, you'd watch the film, play, or at least watch a short video about this game. So in Kerbal Space Program, it's a pretty accurate representation of kind of orbital mechanics. You build rockets and you try to launch those rockets into space and get them into orbit. I've never really managed to get much further than that, but the whole solar system's there, you can go land on the moon. So you've got to build these kind of quite accurate simulations of a rocket. And there's a great XKCD comic by a guy called Randall Monroe who actually worked at NASA, who talks about how well he understood orbital mechanics. You know, he got a physics degree, he got an actual job at NASA, how well he understands it's going up. And then as soon as he starts playing Kerbal Space Program, it goes all the way up. Because although the ideas around orbital mechanics can be communicated, how well you kind of understand those in practice, it comes through play, through the repetition of failure. Another example is a great game called Aftershock, which is a board game developed by Rex Brynan. It's kind of really active developer in this kind of serious games, wargaming space. And this game is a serious game about the Haiti earthquake, and particularly how chaotic and difficult it was to distribute aid as quickly as possible. There are 6 players, and each player represents, and you can have those players as teams of players, represents a different actor who's trying to do the right thing. A non-governmental organization, US military, the local government, the UN World Food Programme and things like that. So they're all trying to do the right thing, but they've all got different goals and they've all got different parameters constraining their actions. The NGO, for example, really wants more publicity for this issue, because the more publicity this can get back in America, the more funds they're going to be able to raise, so the more food they're going to be able to bring in. But there's also a randomness to the game, because it's very difficult to know what is going to happen next and anticipate that. And that's kind of the nature of the decision making that you need to be making if you're involved in a situation like this, is you've got to be able to anticipate the unanticipated and act in ways that don't leave you hanging. So the game uses a stack of cards of random events. One of the random events, for instance, is that a celebrity will fly into the airport and really raise the profile of the issue. This is based on a real event where John Travolta flew his 747 into Haiti. They put shopping bags of food on the seats, but it wasn't so great for everybody else because it used up half the capacity of the airport for a day. And a bunch of volunteers then had to work out how to get the food off of the plane and then distributing it, which was much more labor intensive than unloading cargo off of it. An interesting note, when I was speaking with Rex Brynan about this game at a conference once, is that it uses a deck of cards, because early drafts of the game used dice. But he found that very serious non-gamer types didn't like playing with dice. So you'd roll the dice and then you'd see on a table what happened. Okay, cool, I got 27, so then this event happens. Instead, by switching to a deck that's shuffled and predetermined, even though the possibilities of what's going to occur are the same with dice and with the deck, people felt like the dice were random and it was acting, they were just unlucky with their dice roll. But because a deck is predetermined, nobody felt like they were getting unlucky. That it was set at start during play, and then the game unfolds. So it's really interesting there how like small design elements can affect the way that we experience these educational games. I've played this game, and for me it's Rex, when he runs these games, there's a kind of chaoticness to it, because we're all trying to communicate and coordinate and do the right thing, but we have to act quickly for each of our turns. So often we'll do things that inadvertently affect other people. And everybody can win, but also only one person can win, or half the people can win, depending on how it goes. And so there's a lot of like real situations embedded in the game that you learn about through play, like John Travolta and his 747, but there's also a kind of tacit feel for those kind of situations. And so this game is played with majors in the US military to kind of understand what their role is and maybe what some of the challenges are going to be before going into this situation. Another similar board game that refers to the complexity in kind of similar ways is ISIS Crisis, where that uses kind of narrative discussion along with the game board, cards, and characters to help us memorize, where we similarly have each player representing a different actor in the Syrian civil war. The different sides of the Syrian civil war: Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the US, Russia, and Turkey. And we start to really see how everybody acting from their opposing interests can really create a chaotic situation very quickly. This game makes claims about how this scenario works. For instance, the ISIS player is able to take their turn whenever they want, which is meant to reflect the kind of responsiveness and quickness that an organization like ISIS was able to have in comparison to the US and Russia, which were much slower to act in the way that they are kind of larger and more bureaucratic organizations. So these games like Aftershock, Kerbal Space Program, and ISIS Crisis are trying to model the complexity of this situation to understand a really deep and complex idea. But then through the processes of playing, I begin to understand them in more detail. But what I'm only understanding is the designer's representation of this system. I don't truly know it. Remember, things are always getting left out. Remembering Gregory Bateson, it's representations all the way down. And with that, we am ending part 2. And in the next lecture, I'm going to be talking about cultural rhetoric. Thanks very much.